Okay, well, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Coco Crum. Coco is principal with Oliver Wight Americas, and she is extremely knowledgeable in the areas of demand management, integrated business planning, and S&OP. I've heard her speak on multiple occasions, and I've learned a great deal from her books and presentations. So I'm sure today will be a very informative presentation. And we're very pleased that she's agreed to present for us today. So without any further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Coco to begin our webinar, Integrating Statistical Forecasts with Other Input to Create a Demand Plan for S&OP.
Thank you, Eric. It's always a pleasure working with the folks from Forecast Pro. And when Forecast Pro suggested talking about multiple views of demand planning, I thought it was a timely topic. At Oliver Wight, a frequently asked question we get from clients is, how do we use different views of demand to create a proposed plan? The question is frequently spurred by complaints about forecast accuracy. Here's how the dialogue goes within companies. Management and business leaders frequently ask, why is the forecast not more accurate? The demand planning function oftentimes will respond, well, the sales organization doesn't sell the forecast. And the sales and oftentimes the marketing organizations will say, but the forecasts weren't my numbers. They were your numbers, not my numbers. And the demand planning organization responds in turn, but you won't cooperate and give us your input, so we went with the statistical forecast. One thing I know for sure is that when sales and marketing provide input into the demand plan, the chances of improving accuracy increase dramatically. So today we want to focus on how to get sales and marketing to participate in the demand planning process. We'll talk about how to develop scenarios that address different views of demand. We found that scenarios are a useful approach for reaching consensus on a demand plan, especially when there are various views of demand and views that differ. So I hope you'll leave this seminar with some ideas on how to better engage sales and marketing in the planning process. But before we begin discussing multiple views, I think we ought to review three basic fundamentals. First, let's start with the definition of demand. Demand and demand planning is sometimes confused with supply and supply planning. The two are related, but they are not the same. Demand is what customers need and want to buy. A demand plan should include timing, when the customers want to buy the product, and when appropriate, also the location where they need it. Demand is different from planning how to make physical product or services available in response to the demand plan, in response to customer orders, or in response to your inventory or safety stock tactics. Making the physical product or service available is a separate function. It's sometimes called supply planning or production planning or inventory planning. So something to consider when you're considering, we're focused on demand now, not supply and supply planning. Something to consider with regard to demand is the genesis of demand. That brings us to the second fundamental of demand planning, and that is demand doesn't just happen. Think about what causes customers and consumers to buy your company's products or services. It is sales and marketing activities that cause them to purchase. And because marketing and sales activities are what generates demand for a business, The demand plan should be based on marketing and selling activities that are planned in the future. Too often, in my experience, the fallback position is to use a statistical forecast as the demand plan. But there's a problem with solely relying on the statistical forecast. And that problem brings us to the third fundamental of demand planning, and that's that a statistical forecast alone is insufficient for planning demand. Think about it. A statistical forecast is based on history, either order history or shipment history. But how often does history repeat itself? Most businesses are not striving to maintain the status quo. They're striving to grow, to introduce new products, enter new markets, and develop new customers. That is why history alone will not enable you to develop the most accurate demand plan. The demand plan ought to be the future view of the business and of demand, not the past view. So relying solely on history of demand is like looking into a rear view mirror while you're driving your car, rather than looking through the windshield and anticipating changes that are going to happen in the road as you're moving forward. This isn't to say that your company should stop using a statistical forecast, especially if you have a large number of items to plan. The statistical forecast is a valuable view, but it is only one view of demand. It is one input into the demand plan. It should not be used as the output of the demand planning process. In my experience, the most effective demand planning processes consider these other views of demand. It's the marketing and brand input, the sales input, the product portfolio input, customer schedules and customer inputs, and also the business plan and strategy. So in developing the demand plan, the planner needs to determine when to rely on the statistical forecast and when to give greater weight to the other views of demand. A statistical forecast is most accurate when there is low variability in demand, period by period, and when future changes are going to be few future changes in demand, whether it's total volume, volume by period, seasonality. Some companies plot their subfamilies and sometimes items along this type of matrix, where you see volume here being low or high and variability here being low or high. When demand variability is low, whether the volume is large or small, the statistical forecast can be fairly dependable. It's possible to use the statistical forecast as a baseline and ask sales and marketing to just provide information on what will be significantly different in the future. Let's see an explanation of how you can use a tool to know the reliability of a statistical forecast for a high volume item with low demand variability. Eric?
And what I'm going to do is just give you a little tour of some data that is pretty reasonable volume. Again, variability is fairly low. And the type of data where a statistical approach, as Coco said, would provide a valuable starting point for reaching a consensus forecast or a baseline. The data that we're using is from a commercial bakery, a bakery that sells muffins and cakes and sells it in large grocery store chains. So we can see here we have the different categories, muffins and cakes. And if we drill down, we get to the customer level. So we can view the data at a customer level, and we can drill down further and see down to individual SKUs, stock keeping units. So this would be blueberry muffins in a certain packaging style for Stuff Mart as the customer. I'll go ahead and expand this, and you can see we've got a fair amount of data. Now, if we look at a statistical forecast, and this webinar really won't go into any great depth here, but I will use the approach that Coco referred to as using the rear view mirror to forecast going forward, and do what's called a time series forecast or an extrapolation based on strictly on the past demand of the history. And what you can see now is, in addition to the historic data, where we've got about 3 or 4 months, we also have a forecast. And we have a forecast at all levels. So we forecasted at the SKU level and at the customer, category, and grand total. And again, this being fairly reasonable volumes sold, there's a fair amount of structure here, a fair amount of continuity between the past and the future, and statistical methods work quite well. Now, how do we measure that? There's a batch of ways. One thing we can do is look at how well we fit. So how well does the statistical method track the historic demand? And I've overlaid this red line to sort of show us, in this example, that we are indeed capturing some seasonal patterns and some trend. We're sort of missing it at some places. And we can walk through some of the data. We could also take a more quantitative view of how well we fit by looking at some statistics. So I won't belabor this, but the idea is we could look at what's called within sample statistics, things like the R-squared, or maybe a percentage error like the MAPE, to determine how much variability we're dealing with. We could also track accuracy historically by recording the forecasts and comparing them to what actually happened. But again, the main point here is that for data like the data on the screen, this automatic approach using a statistically based forecast as a starting point or a baseline is a quite reasonable way to proceed. So we'll pass the presentation back to Coco and talk a little more about the collaborative process.
Thank you, Eric. So to reiterate, for products that have low variability, you saw the graphical picture, the fit. You saw 10% mean absolute percent error and a high adjusted R-squared. The planner may determine that, gosh, this is going to be a fairly reliable statistical forecast based on history. And the planner may choose to give sales and marketing the output of that statistical forecast and just ask them to provide information on what's going to be different going forward. This approach will save sales and marketing time. Now, for those products with high variability, the statistical forecast won't be as reliable. So it's imperative in those cases to get input from sales and marketing. This is where you'd ideally like sales and marketing to focus their time and effort. But you need to ask sales and marketing certain questions. Here are some topics to consider when you're asking sales and marketing to give you input on their future plans and how they're influencing demand going forward. For marketing and brand management, it might be what are the growth plans, the promotion plans, the pricing plans, what market intelligence have they gathered. For sales, of course, is what are the customer plans and the territory plans. For product portfolio, it's all around life cycles, management, introduction plans, what products will be exiting the business. For customers, what are their buying schedules or purchase plans, their promotion plans and expansion plans. And of course, you need to ask about the business plans. Are there any plans to change our business plans going forward. Expect that you'll get different views of demand. For instance, this is an example where one sales or marketing person is reporting that competitors are lowering their prices. Another may have the view the brand's going to grow 10%. There may be an opportunity that's going to bring 8% growth, etc. But don't expect the views to always agree. So the question becomes, how can the planning tool assist us in the demand planning process when there are various views of demand? And Eric, let me turn it over to you and so you can give us some examples.
And so what we're doing now, again, previously we sort of looked at generating a statistical forecast and looking at the variability of the data and saying, do we expect a statistical forecast to do well? And we floated the idea that a statistical forecast is a good starting point or baseline. So what I'm showing you now is sort of the same data, but I'm now concentrating on establishing a different view. And currently I'm establishing a marketing view. So what I've got is a statistical baseline. This was generated using a statistical forecasting method. And again, this sort of tells us if we have a great deal of continuity between what's happened in the past and what's happened in the future, then this would be a fairly reliable starting point. And now the question, as Coco posed it earlier, is what's going to change in the future? What's the part that the past is not telling us? Where is the road going, so to speak? And so what I've done is to put in some adjustments. And there's different ways of doing this, but I've put them in as incremental adjustments. So this row here, I've said we're going to launch a new product, and I expect that to add some volume. And it's going to be launched starting in January. And according to marketing, you can see I've got a little comment down here. It says new product launch will lift sales by 20%. And so we've made an assumption, which is things will change going forward when we launch this product, and we'll need an adjustment to the forecast to reflect the fact that we're expanding the product line, and presumably that's going to expand our sales as well. You'll notice I've got another row here labeled promotions, and there is an entry there. It says BOGOF, buy one, get one free. So we have another planned promotion that's in the future, and again, it's another example of something that we are bringing to the table, our knowledge about the future, which is not incorporated into the statistical forecast, but we're bringing it to the table in the form of our marketing view. We also apparently got wind of a competitive promotion. It says here Archway, another bakery, is price promoting, and we're expecting that to decrease our sales a bit. But the main concept here is that marketing is going to develop their view of the future as part of the S&OP process. They may use a statistical forecast as a baseline and then add to that what they know about the future going forward. They want a good way to give visibility. What are the assumptions here? How much are we assuming that this new product or that this promotion is going to change our demand? We need to document it because this is an ongoing process, so that next month, the month after, we're going to be revisiting this. So this is an example of, again, the marketing taking a look at this, and other parts of the organization, say the sales or brand management or other parts of the organization, will also be developing their view of the future. And before I pass it back to Coco, I'm going to go to another view. So we were looking at a sales view, and now we're looking at a worksheet or a view in Forecast Pro that was sort of designed for, say, establishing the final forecast when I've got both, in this example, sales and marketing in the same room. So it's the kind of thing you might project up against the wall and talk about. Notice we have the statistical forecast, and now we have a bunch of adjustments which are defining our current proposal or our current scenario. In addition to that, we have the marketing view. And we have this row that I inserted here that I called delta, but it's the difference between what marketing came up with and what the current scenario is showing. And in fact, if we look at that, you can see there really are no differences except for this one for August, where actually in this example, sales brought something to the table marketing wasn't aware of, that the customers in the Northeast are going through a major remodel, and they have brought the demand down by 10,000 units. So this is the kind of thing that during the meeting we would discuss, decide what's the proper adjustment, are we sure it's actually going to happen, etc. But we sort of decide upon it. If we look over here, you can see this was our coupon, or our buy one, no, actually this is the competitive promotion. Apparently sales didn't have that in their view, so again, another item to discuss. Finally, if we look at the launch, you can see that's reflected here. Both sales and marketing were aware of the launch. Both of them made adjustments, but you can see they're quite different adjustments. And right now the sales, in particular, in this scenario, for example, they were saying, we may be launching in January, but Stuff Mart is actually not going to be selling it then. So we don't think that adjustment to sales should be made in January at all. And perhaps after some discussion, that was agreed to be correct. So maybe what they do is they end up removing that volume. And let's just actually remove that comment as well, or maybe put a new one in and say product launch will not sell in stuff, and helps if I can type, will not sell until, say, February. Okay, so I'm going to make that adjustment, and notice that updates our differences here. I've left the comment so that next month we can still come back and understand. Here, perhaps sales had a more pessimistic view of how quickly people would adopt the product. Maybe after discussion we decide to leave it as is. But it's just an example. And what I'm trying to get across is a couple of ideas. One is the statistical forecast as a baseline, as a starting point. The other is the different parts of the organization. Marketing coming up with their view, sales coming up with their view. The fact that the views are not going to be the same. There will be differences. And then part of the S&OP process of bringing people together, understanding where there are differences, discussing why there are differences, and shooting for a plan that everyone can get behind, that everyone agrees is reasonable, and to work off of one set of numbers. So again, this is the type of process, and just an example of the type of process that companies can go through. I'll also just point out here that we are working at a customer level. So this particular planning process is working at the customer. The other levels, when I make changes at a customer level, are going to automatically reflect that. So the fact that I've made these changes to the customer level will proportionally allocate down to, say, the SKU level. Again, marketing and sales didn't have a view here, so we've got that as not applicable. But you can see that the statistical forecast and the final forecast are different because they reflect changes made up at the customer level. Anything above that clearly is going to be aggregated to get the totals, but it will automatically come up with a reconciled forecast between the different levels. So with that, let me pass the baton back to Coco and learn some more about collaboration.
Thank you, Eric. That was an excellent example of how views may be different, and also an example of what you might bring to a demand review. The purpose of a demand review is to reach consensus on an aggregate view of future demand. Best practice is over a rolling 24-month planning horizon. A key takeaway is the need to make different views of demand visible. Don't hide them. And the different views, especially if they're significantly different, should be presented at the demand review either to reach consensus or validate the consensus that has already been reached. Here's an example of the type of important information to bring to a demand review when there are differences of opinions or views. In this example, there's an opportunity with the customer, and that opportunity creates the question of whether the company should go after that customer's business or not. The sales wants to, of course, but the margin, as you can see here in this example, is going to be lower than the company's target for margin. And as a result, marketing and financial management are not as certain that trading volume and revenue for margin is healthy for the business. Note the key assumptions that are documented for this scenario. The assumptions are factual. Documenting the facts can help strip emotion from the discussion, and it helps management to focus on what's key for the business and to discuss business implications. Also note how the key takeaways are summarized. This helps the management team to focus on what areas of the business or this particular issue that need to be top of mind during the discussion. Also note how the decisions that need to be made both immediately and in the future are summarized. This makes expectations and timing of decisions clear to the sales and marketing leaders. A similar approach in communicating pertinent information for the demand review can be used in presenting product family information. The purpose of the demand review, of course, is for sales and marketing management to reach consensus on the aggregate demand plan. And so they need certain product information. This information includes a comparison of the demand plan to the budget, and the budget data is shown in this chart in the light blue background. It's also helpful to see what's changed since last month. And here, this is the vertical bars or the current proposed demand plan, and the black line is last month's demand plan. You'll notice, like the previous example, there's areas for key takeaways and key decisions, as well as key assumptions. And also, there can be a summary of quantifying the changes made since last month and how we're evolving for where we'll end up at year end and next year. It's also important to remember that sales and marketing management tend to be financially oriented. And, you know, that is their language. So they need to know how volume plans will translate into projections of revenue and margin. And they tend to think in terms of annual buckets, sometimes quarterly buckets. And they also need to understand, is there a gap between our annual plan or budget and our latest projections? So here in these examples, this is dealing with revenue. The blue bar is the annual plan. The green vertical bar is last month's plan for the year. And this is our latest projection of how revenue is shaping up for year end. So the key point, just like you don't want to hide the different views of demand, you don't want to hide gaps in meeting our annual plan and targets for revenue and margin. The sooner any gaps are exposed, the better, because it gives you more time to deal with the marketing and sales activities that are needed to close the gap. Otherwise, you end up at year-end scrambling and probably making decisions on activities that aren't in really the best financial interests of the company. So in wrapping up today, let's revisit ways to overcome the resistance of sales and marketing to provide their views of demand. One remedy is in educating sales and marketing on why their input is important, with a focus on what's in it for them when they do provide the input. Another effective remedy is for the demand planning organization to change its mindset around its role in the planning process. And one role of the demand planning organization is to make it easy for sales and marketing to provide its input. Sales and marketing do plan, and the task for the demand planning organization is to leverage the plans and budgets and goals that have already been developed by the sales and marketing organizations. Some of the most effective demand planners I've worked with have this attitude towards sales and marketing. They provide last month's plan and assumptions and maybe some analysis about what happened last month, and they just ask sales and marketing to tell them what's going to change going forward. Their approach, when they use this approach, it's more of a partner approach. It's saying, I'm going to bring you feedback and analysis so you can see what's going well and what may not be going well and needs their attention, such as a customer not buying as planned or a promotion not bringing the lift that was anticipated. This may be a very different approach for some demand planning organizations, especially when those functions sit within the supply chain. And so I want to bring you the approach of one of my clients. And this particular client views demand planners and the demand planning organization, views their roles as that of being a trusted advisor. When the demand planners asked the VP of supply chain his expectation of them, here's what he said. He said that he viewed them, even though they resided in the supply chain organization, he viewed their role as being trusted advisors. And that means they'd earned the trust of sales and marketing. And in order to earn that trust, it meant to him that the demand planners were giving the right advice effectively to sales and marketing. And so he was encouraging them to strive to become viewed as being credible and reliable, being viewed that they really had intimate knowledge of their business segment, and that their focus was on what was good for the company rather than a self-centric focus. And he also shared for him what the benefits of being a trusted advisor were. And he said the more your customers trust your advice, the more they'll reach out to you for advice. The more they'll respect you and treat you the way you expect to be treated. And also the more they'd share information that would help the demand planner to help them. And what he was looking for was for sales and marketing to refer to the demand planners as being great contributors and also to give them a benefit of the doubt. And, you know, nobody's going to be perfect. A demand plan is never 100% perfect. And so they needed to have enough respect for the demand planners to forgive mistakes and protect the demand planners when they needed it. Give them a heads up of dangers to avoid, and involve them early when there were issues that needed to be addressed, and also to reach out and trust the instinct of the demand planners and the judgment of the demand planners. So I'm indebted to George Tedigan of Cavendish Farms for his view of what the demand planners ought to be. They weren't number pushers in his view. What they are people that provide a real contribution to sales and marketing and the business overall. So in concluding, I hope you take away that demand planning is more than statistical forecasting, and that the demand planners play an important role in the organization as a collaborator with the commercial side of the business, with sales, marketing, brand management, and product management. The role that the demand planner plays when the expectation is of being a trusted advisor requires that the demand planners understand the business, understand those sales and marketing activities that are going to make demand happen. And when you couple that understanding with the analytical skills and good use of planning tools, the demand planners should be able to assimilate various views of the business and bring reliable judgment and recommendations on the future projections of demand, and also help the organization understand the contingencies that ought to be considered. So in concluding, a demand planner is much more than a number cruncher, and the most important skills that a demand planner can bring to the role are communication, collaboration, and teamwork skills. So I'll now hand off back to Eric to conclude our presentation.
Before we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, I just want to bring up a few things to make you aware of. The examples in today's webinar, I was using the Forecast Pro package, specifically Forecast Pro Track. If you are interested in learning more about Forecast Pro or forecasting software in general, we'd love to talk to you about it. We also do offer live WebEx-based demonstrations of the product. We can even use your own data. And if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to visit our website, forecastpro.com. A lot of good information there. Or give us a call, or even send us a note in the chat box, and if you want to schedule a time to see the product. Next slide, please. Our next webinar. This is actually, before I get there, I think that's the next slide, but we do offer, as a company, in addition to these webinars, we do also have seminars and product training. If you are interested in these services, again, visit our website for more information. I would like to mention we have scheduled a 3-day forecasting class called Techniques, Best Practices, and Applications using Forecast Pro. It will be held in May on the 7th through the 9th in Boston. So if you are interested in learning more about statistical forecasting, the methods that are used, how they work, and how to apply them, then that seminar is for you. And the next slide, please, Coco. Okay, and finally, this does bring us to our next webinar. The webinar that you've attended is part of a quarterly webinar series. We give a webinar each quarter. And coming up next April is the ins and outs of using dynamic regression models for forecasting. So we'll be looking at basically forecasting methodology. How is regression used to improve forecast accuracy when is it appropriate, how do we bring in causality rather than just extrapolating from the past. I'll actually present that webinar, and again, it'll be April 17th. If you are interested in attending, you can actually visit forecastpro.com and sign up now, and we'll send you reminders as it gets closer. But hopefully we'll see some of you there as well. And I think, let's go forward a slide, please. And I think that brings us to the question and answer portion. And we have had quite a few questions come in via the chat. I see people still writing on the other side of the table from me, so I guess some more are coming in. But Coco, I'll feed you the questions that have come in.
Okay.
And the first one is, what is the difference between the demand plan and the budget? How do the two operate in the same environment? Are they the same? And if not, how do we separate the two?
There is a difference between the demand plan and the budget. If you think about the budgeting process, it tends to occur annually, and a budget or an annual plan is put together. That should be used as a reference point every month as part of the demand planning process. And the demand plan is the latest projection of demand. So oftentimes as the months go by in a year, there will be a difference between the latest projections of demand and the annual plan or budget because things happen. Things happen in the marketplace, things happen with customers, things happen with your own internal activities to influence demand. So how do you operate in the environment is you always want to show what the annual plan is, but you also always want to show what the latest projections are. And when there is a difference between the two, then that should drive actions and activities around how are we going to close the gap between what our annual plan and budget is versus the latest projections.
Okay, and another question. What is the best advice to approach sales teams, marketing teams, and executives to stress the importance of collaboration?
You know, my best advice is educating them on the need, but relating it to them and their priorities. There's nothing worse than spending time and attention in nurturing and developing a customer only to find out after the customer has placed the order that we're unable to provide the product at the time and the volume that the customer wanted it. So, you know, that's painful to have to be apologizing to customers. So if you can orient it around, if you can give us input on how your activities are going to impact demand and in what volume and what timing, then we can make sure that we communicate the plan as a request for product to the supply organization so they can do their supply planning to ensure that product is going to be available. And so relating it to their pain points is often the best approach.
Okay. And another question. Does Oliver Wight recommend looking at the data at a fully detailed SKU by customer level? How detailed should we get?
The answer to that question is it depends upon which point of the planning horizon are you focused on. Time and attention should be paid to the complete planning horizon. And as I mentioned, best practice today is a minimum 24 months rolling. So if you're focused on next year and beyond, you know, my view is it's wasteful to be planning at the detail SKU by customer location. Rather, when you're further out in the planning horizon, you want to be assumption driven and at the aggregate level as to what's going to happen. And so you may look at aggregate level by business segment, by product family aggregation. As you move closer into time, in that mid-term range, you may be planning at a subfamily level, where, you know, subfamilies are organized by possibly common materials that have certain lead times. And so in order to enable the procurement or purchasing organization to do their planning, they need a more detailed information than at the aggregate. Now when you get close in, this month, next month, depending on your production lead times, that may be when you need to be at the SKU or item level, maybe by customer, sometimes by location. However, what I always like to tell demand planning organizations is lean is your friend. Encourage the supply planning and production organizations to be stripping lead time, so that, you know, the best thing you can do is not have to predict at that customer by SKU or item by location, but rather have the flexibility to be able to respond and deliver product when you get the order.
Okay, very good. We've got time for a couple more. So the next one here is, how often should we update or refresh the statistical baseline forecast?
Well, a minimum is once a month. And remember, the statistical forecast should be driven by order history or shipment history. And your demand planning process, especially if you're supporting sales and operations planning or integrated business planning process, that process is monthly. So at a minimum, you should be refreshing every month. Where I see refreshes that can occur more frequently is when you're introducing new products or new items, when there's a lot of uncertainty or change that's occurring. But if you're trying to update the statistical forecast every week or every day, I would say, you know, that's probably a wasted activity.
Okay, very good. And we'll make this the last question. What's the recommendation if you are introducing statistical forecasting software into the forecast process, where historically we've relied heavily on our customer and sales input? So we need to incorporate the statistical view, but how can we do this without losing the sales input?
If you're introducing a tool into your planning process, Oliver Wight, we follow a change management methodology that we call the proven path. It's so named because if you follow it step by step, the success rate is about 99% successful in implementing change. And the implementation of a tool is change. And so our recommendation is to follow this change management process, so you step back and you re-educate the key folks, including your leadership team, on what this capability will bring you, and therefore how do we change our vision and view of how we're going to operate in the future. And then based on reaching agreement of that vision of the future, then to redesign your process and redesign it in a way that it's considering people and competency, the new process and how it ought to be conducted, as well as the optimal way to configure the tool to support the process and the way that people want to work.
Okay, well, very good. I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to thank our presenter, Coco Crum, for taking the time and educating us today. I certainly thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. I'm sure others did as well. So many thanks to Coco. And thanks to all of you who've taken an hour out of your day to learn a bit more about integrating statistical forecasts with other input in the effort to create a demand plan for S&OP and integrated business planning. So again, thank you all for coming today, and hope to see you at another webinar in the near future.